Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Now, I have to confess, I struggle sometimes to explain this podcast to people listening for the first time, so I've enlisted Sean Penn. Sean, how would you describe it?
A profound life experience.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast, they're more mainstream leaning than anything. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. Instead, I try to celebrate the fact that films are made. It's really difficult to get them made. I kind of want to salute the fact that they exist. Without further ado, let me take you all the way back to 1997. I'll play you a clip from a trailer and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
What do you get for the man who has everything?
Happy birthday, sir. Thank you, Maggie.
I don't like her. So what brings you to town, Conrad? Everything all right? October 12th. Nikki's birthday. This is for you. Consumer Recreation Services. Call that number. Why? They make your life fun. What are you selling?
It's a game.
A game.
Specifically tailored for each participant.
John, chapter 9, verse 25. Whereas once I was blind, now I can see. Now I can see.
That then was a clip from 1997's The Game, directed by David Fincher, written by John Brancato and Michael Ferris, and starring Michael Douglas, Sean Penn, Deborah Kara Unger, James Rebhorn, Peter Donat, Carol Baker and Armin Muller-Stahl. And the story of The Game just go back to those two screenwriters, John D. Brancato and Michael Ferris, who had come together and penned a spec script. Now, a spec script is just that, a screenplay put together on spec that a studio hasn't paid for, the idea being that you work on a script, you put it out to market, and hopefully someone snaps it up and makes you a fair bit of money in doing so. And in the case of Brancato and Ferris, they put their spec script out to market and it was snapped up by MGM. They'd fashioned a thriller called The Game, and it was ultimately about a man who could afford everything, who's gifted for his birthday a game of the title that would change his life. Now, this was very much a case of the right script at the right time, that Hollywood was in the market for thrillers. It was banking a lot of money off the back of thrillers, films such as Fatal Attraction, Presumed Innocent, movies like that weren't massively expensive to make but were generating sizable profits. And so if you had an interesting thriller, there was a sporting chance you would at least get it read. In the case of The Game, it got bought up. Now, I'm grateful to James Swallow's book, Dark Eye, the films of David Fincher, for filling in a couple of the gaps here, but also the fact that I think it's pretty well known that the first director to get involved with The Game wasn't actually David Fincher, its ultimate director. Instead, it was a man called Jonathan Mostow, who was developing a whole host of projects with a view of trying to get at least one of them over the line. And he came very close, as it happened, to making The Game. He was attached for about a year or so. And as he described it in an interview with Vulture, in the version of The Game I developed, Michael Douglas's character was trapped in this paranoid nightmare, and he believed that everybody was in on the conspiracy, but at the end it was just a handful of people who were manipulating things. Now, I'm deliberately going to go spoiler light, as I tend to do on these podcasts anyway, because The Game is the kind of film that's very, very twisty, and you don't really want anyone giving it away. So that's about as spoilery as you'll get. But one thing that came about as Mostow developed is it just started to languish a little bit before MGM ultimately decided to put the project into turnaround. It wasn't going to make it. Mostow had got to the point of casting. I mean, he was location scouting as well at one point, and he'd got Bridget Fonda and Carl MacLachlan lined up to take the 2 lead roles. The filming was going to start in February of 1993, but things behind the scenes were changing. And notably in 1992, a company called Polygram, now part of Universal, was trying to move from its European music operation to get into the movies. And so it picked the script up from MGM when MGM put it into turnaround, and it decided it was going to invest in this particular project. Against that background, Jonathan Mostow would slowly drift away from this one, and the game, as development continued on it, would be picked up by Propaganda Films, a company that David Fincher was heavily involved with, that also Polygram would also go on to acquire. Now, Propaganda had started up in 1986, a music and film production company that was spearheaded by a whole bunch of directors who we know very much now. People like Michael Bay was heavily cutting his teeth at Propaganda. Dominic Senna, who had gone to direct Gone in 60 Seconds, for instance. And by 1990, I found this statistic, Propaganda was producing around a third of all the music videos being made in America by the major labels. And so it had key directors and directors who were branching into the movies, and David Fincher was one of them. So Fincher got interested in the game as Mostow was soon off the project, and he would instead focus his energies on the not enormously dissimilar thriller Breakdown that I've covered on a previous episode of this podcast. But also Fincher was coming at a point where his career was, certainly his movie career, was not in a great place. It's very well known that 1992's Alien 3, his feature directorial debut, was not the film he wanted it to be, that there are heavy stories of studio interference on that one, that Fincher at that point was in his 20s and didn't really have the power to exert his influence over the movie that he wanted to make, and it was an unhappy experience for him, and it's not a movie he talks about a lot at all. In fact, he doesn't really regard it as one of his films. So he knew that whatever movie he was going to pick up to do his second was going to have, well, it's going to have to be a lot more him. He's going to a lot more control over it, and for a while the game was going to be it. But he was also juggling a thriller called Seven. You might have heard of that one. And it was a case of that whilst he was attracted to the game, it was Seven that went into pole position when Brad Pitt suddenly became available for that movie. And so Fincher quickly set that up as his next feature. Now, Seven, of course, would go on to be a career maker for David Fincher. Released in 1995, it wouldn't only earn significant critical acclaim, it would also prove to be a sizable box office hit. And off the back of that, Fincher found himself a man very, very much in demand. But he still was interested in making the game. And as it would turn out, the game would release just 2 years after Seven. It'd be the shortest gap between movies in Fincher's filmography. And it was the success of Seven that gave him the creative freedom to choose the film that he wanted to make, and also for Polygram, once Fincher committed to making the game, to put more money into the project, that the scale of it could go up, the profile could go up, and writers, I mean, in 1995, more writers were coming on board, and the whole project started to move forward at greater speed at that point. Now, Fincher would explain in an interview with Empire magazine that rewrites were ongoing. He said, we probably did 4 or 5 rewrites with different people. And he said, finally, after I did 7, we did about 6 weeks of just changing the tone and trying to make the story work. He explained that initially the person who perpetrates the game of the title was a university chum of the lead character, Nick Van Orton, and I just didn't feel there was enough backstory, so it's a pretty obvious change to make it into a brother, played by Sean Penn. But was it? Was it that obvious a turn to make that character the brother? Because there were all sorts of bits and bobs going on there as well. So let's head to the Cannes Film Festival in 1996. And at that point, Polygram put out an announcement of the first major piece of casting for the game. And that was Jodie Foster. Now, Jodie Foster was to play the role that ultimately would be taken on by Sean Penn. And it would go through, inevitably, several changes to get to that point. It would also result in a lawsuit that on June the 6th, 1996, not long after the Cannes Film Festival, Jodie Foster took Polygram to court. Now, this was unusual for a couple of reasons. Number one, the very fact she was taking someone to court over a film that hadn't been made yet was a big deal. But also, she had a development deal at Polygram as well. Her Egg Pictures company was set up with the studio, but she was said to be furious with the way Polygram had acted over the casting of the game, and so filed a suit where, depending which source you believe, Entertainment Weekly had it at $54.5 million. James Swallow's book had it at $15.4 million. Nonetheless, it was alleged that by Foster that in November 1995, Polygram had made an oral agreement with her to co-star in the movie, and she was set to work 4 weeks on the project for a fee of $4.5 million and a chunk of the takings as well. What happened with Foster's involvement, as well as Fincher's, of course, is the profile lifts again, and she alleged that Polygram thus used that to lure Michael Douglas to take the lead role in the game, and Douglas was a huge coup for the game to get. Douglas, of course, had built his career on edgy roles and being able to turn them into commercial successes, and so he was perfect casting, really, for the film that Fincher wanted to make. But there was an 18-year age gap between Michael Douglas and Jodie Foster, and it brought with it disagreements over who should play what, how it should all be set up, as Entertainment Weekly reported at the time. Douglas wanted Foster to play the role of his sister. Foster wanted the character to be his daughter, and Polygram denied the allegations, and over time the role that Foster was due to play was instead retooled as, are you following this, as Michael Douglas's character's brother instead, at which point the role was offered to Jeff Bridges, who turned it down. Now, Fincher, for his part, argued there was a slightly different spin on the story, that he suggested that Jodie Foster's commitment to making the film Contact with director Robert Zemeckis was what made scheduling impossible. There was no falling out between Fincher and Foster, or if there was, it was short-lived, because the pair would unite for the film Panic Room some years later. But Fincher was putting out the line that it was a scheduling clash that led to Foster's departure. Now, in Film and Video magazine, again around the time of the film's release, there would be another spin on it. And Fincher said when she expressed interest, we didn't have Michael Douglas or a final script. She just wanted to be in it. And Fincher argued, he said, I think it's a little distracting for the waitress in the film to be played by a two-time Oscar winner. So Foster, he says, called back and said, well, what if I play the brother's part? Would you rewrite it for me? I thought that was very interesting, Fincher said, especially as I have two sisters, so that made sense to me. Of course, everyone else, like Michael and Sean and producer Steve Golan, have brothers, and when Michael and Sean got involved, they're all going, how could you ever see it any other way? It's definitely a brother battle. And at that point, Fincher just ceded the point, okay, I believe you, but by that point anyway, Foster had moved on and was in the midst of shooting Contact. Sean Penn would come in and take that role on that was originally going to be played by Foster. Other bits of casting, well, Deborah Kara Unger had just made David Cronenberg's film Crash and submitted a sequence from that as part of her audition to land the role in the game. For Douglas's part, he would laud the script in press interviews for this one, not least the fact that it's a very difficult movie to second guess. But he did admit he was a little bit wary of working with David Fincher, a man known primarily for commercials. He says in the early stage, you're thinking, yeah, music video, commercials, yeah, right, this is one of those visual directors. And there was good-natured back and forth between Fincher and Douglas on this. But then Douglas also said, all of a sudden, you're totally surprised at how well he watches performances, and the pair clearly clicked. That said, it was still it still wasn't a no-brainer for Douglas that he signs on the dotted line for this one, and that was as much down to the company behind the movie as the movie itself, because Polygram was launching into the American market and looking to launch its own films and distribute its own films, but it wasn't a Hollywood major. Michael Douglas's big hits had all been made for big studios, the likes of Warner Brothers, the likes of Paramount, and that's what he was used to, the machinery of a major studio that was able to sell a film. And there was a question mark about whether Polygram had the infrastructure, if he did commit to making a film, the game, to promote and push the movie out, that it was very much a novice in this particular area of the business. Now, Douglas, of course, wasn't, and Oscar-winning producer long before he was an Oscar-winning actor. He won an Oscar for producing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, of course, before he took home his Best Actor Academy Award for Wall Street. He knew the mechanics of the film business and got more involved behind the scenes of the film. Confident, therefore, that if he committed to the film, there was a chance that it was going to be able to find its audience. Douglas signed on the dotted line. Fincher was committed to make it. It had momentum behind it. And with a budget that was in the region, was pushing, once Douglas was on board, towards $60-70 million, Polygram was making a major announcement through its propaganda films arms that it was going to be a big player in Hollywood. This was going to be a big studio film, just not from a traditional studio. Filming would thus begin on August the 13th, 1996, less than a year after Seven had made it into cinemas. Now, there'd been some back and forth with Polygram over just where to shoot the movie, that while parts of it was shot in Los Angeles, the vast bulk was shot in San Francisco. Now, this came at additional cost. That at Los Angeles, it was said, and I go back to James Swallow's book for this statistic, that it would be $2 to $3 million cheaper to shoot the film in Los Angeles. But Fincher was adamant he wanted it set somewhere else. He checked out other American cities as potential homes for the movie. So, for instance, he'd gone to Chicago and done some location scouting there. But what he found was that it didn't have the huge mansions they needed in close enough proximity to the centre of the city to make the story work. Thus, he tootled along to Seattle. He had a look there. But his problem with Seattle was he felt it was all a bit too new money, a bit too glossy, whereas there was something a bit more traditional about San Francisco. And that's where he would not only set the film, but he would also shoot the majority of it. He came into the production utterly prepared. He would say in interviews, as he's done several times, that the actual shooting of the film is his least favourite part of making the movie. But you won't be surprised to hear, if you're familiar with his work, there was lots that he was meticulous on. He was meticulous about the lighting, about getting the darkness right. I mean, a lot of the development work he'd done on the script and brought Andrew Kevin Walker in to do that late polish on it was to take it down a darker path, to make these characters just dislikable, but have them played by people who made them likable, and to put also all kinds of shades of grey in there just to kind of keep the audience guessing as to which way everything was going to go. It presented a challenge and a half for the script supervisor on this one. That was Jamie Babbitt. And Babbitt was charged really with making sure that all of the little details that needed to be in exactly the right place were there. The continuity on this one was hugely, hugely important because it's such a layered story of secrets and lies and deceit and misdirection that getting all the minuscule details absolutely bang on was hugely important. I mean, just the thought of that brings to mind for me the 2007 thriller The Snowman, directed by Thomas Alfredson, starring Michael Fassbender and Rebecca Ferguson, where they didn't get all the footage in place even. By the time they got it to the editing room, they realised lots and lots of parts of this were missing, which made the editing and the final cut of that movie, let's just say it explains quite a few things. And with the game, the preparation was such and the work was such, A, that wasn't an option, and B, that was never going to happen. What was going to happen, in line with the way Fincher tends to shoot his movies, is he would gather a lot of footage, he would do numerous amount of takes, but also, notably on this one, well, the film would shoot for over 100 days. It would be an extremely lengthy shoot, given the kind of film that it was. That filming got underway, as I mentioned, in the summer of 1996, and it wouldn't wrap up until the start of 1997. Just to test the resolve of the cast and crew on this one as well, there were an awful lot of night shoots. If you've seen the game, you'll know quite a lot of it is in darkness or at night time, and the film production schedule had to accommodate that. Also, Fincher had explored the idea of whether it was possible to shoot the film sequentially, to have it all done in order, an idea that quickly had to go out the window really just by the logistics of a film shoot. And it got to a point where the ending of the movie was actually shot about 3 weeks into that 100-day schedule. In fact, more than one ending was shot, and the alternative has turned up on assorted disc releases over the years. The movie would wrap up filming, and by the sounds of it, quite a happy shoot as well. I mean, Douglas and Fincher seem to get on throughout this one, and as much as Fincher would say that he dislikes the shooting of the film, there were actors. I mean, Sean Penn had been tabloid fodder for a while and had a reputation for being a little bit difficult. He'd also directed his own movies, and yet he too seemed to get on this one with bare little problem, and it all seemed to be in the can pretty much on time by January 1997, and so Fincher could take this one into post-production, and Polygram could set an autumn release date for it. This one was motoring along. The obstacle of Jodie Foster's court case, that was settled out of court in the end. I don't have the full ins and outs of the deal, but the fact that Fincher and Foster worked together again does tell you a little bit, I think. Also, Contact would release that same summer, the summer of that year, and would go on to be a good hit in a summer where there weren't a lot of good hits. In the case of the game, though, that was scheduled for release September the 12th, 1997. That's when Polygram put it out for. And the response to the film was actually, I mean, it was pretty mixed. I'm going to come to the fact it's a little bit of the forgotten Fincher in a minute. But there was a critical response, I think, where people went in expecting it to be, for want of a better way of putting it, 7-2. I mean, clearly better than Alien 3, not up to the standards of 7, and quite a cold film. It's certainly stylistically a cold film as well, deliberately so, and that really didn't play wonderfully with quite a few of the regular critics. Now, some people did really go for it, particularly praising the casting of Michael Douglas, the ambiguity of the plot, and not being able to second guess it. There was a feeling that if you saw the film once, that was, I mean, you just didn't need to see it twice, but I would suggest it's one of those. If you go back to, there are quite a few clues that are hiding around in this one, and in fact many subsequent disc releases have come out that have talked about that as well. But still, when it came to actually the release, the test was now for Polygram, could it distribute a movie and get a hit movie in the US? And the answer was, well, yeah, it sort of could. That the film had cost, as I mentioned, 60-70 million to make, and it had movie star expectations on it. On the flip side of that, it was released in the autumn of 1997. By releasing it in September, there's a tacit acknowledgement, really, that this isn't major blockbuster territory, but there might be a little bit of room to make a bit of money there. And the game duly opened at number 1 at the US box office with $14.3 million, a good solid opening weekend, and comfortably the number 1 that weekend as well. The other films that were around were G.I. Jane, had been around for 4 weeks and was in second place with a $3.5 million gross that weekend. Just give you an idea of the gap, really. Other movies that were about, well, they weren't new releases, really. They were, apart from 2 very tiny ones, Different for Girls and Bandwagon, that sat in 19th and 20th place. Other than that, the competition for the game was light, and it was up against films that have been around in cinemas for a while. I mean, the previous week, the chart had been topped by Steven Seagal in Fire Down Below, but the other films that were still in around the top 10 were The Full Monty, Air Force One, Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts, and not a million miles away from the game in one or two ways. Excess Baggage was in there. The mighty George of the Jungle was around. Air Force One had made a lot of money that summer too. But the game had a fairly clear run at it, which would last a week, because the week after, 4 major releases came out at the studios. 1,000 Acres from Disney, LA Confidential from Warner Brothers, Wishmaster came out, and the top slot went to In and Out from Paramount Pictures, the film that famously was inspired by Tom Hanks's Oscar acceptance speech for Philadelphia. But the game was holding its own for a little bit, even as the competition started to toughen up. And by the end of that year, the competition was really, really tough as well. There were a lot of big money makers. That was the year of Titanic. Still, by the time the game had wrapped up in US cinemas, it had made $48.3 million at the American box office, which, I mean, notably down on 7, but not the worst return, really, for a grown-up adult thriller, particularly as these were starting just to slowly drift out of popularity amongst American studios. The film did well, it did comfortably around the world as well. Its overall box office in the end was $109.4 million. And once you factor in DVD and, VHS primarily, but it was one of Polygram's first DVDs. Once you factor in those releases, the company would have made a little profit on it. And of course, the film has come out time and time again on an assortment of different formats, in an assortment of different editions as well. Now, part of that is down to the David Fincher link that he's, of course, gone on to build. I mean, his next film was, again, it was just a couple of years afterwards, and that was Fight Club, which I'll come to in a future episode. But the cachet of David Fincher as a filmmaker was clearly heavily on the art. And The Game often gets overlooked, really, as the film that sits between Seven and Fight Club, two of his very best films. I'd also put Zodiac in there with his very best films, which, again, I will come to on a future episode of Film Stories. But as far as The Game was concerned, I would strongly suggest it is one that just doesn't deserve to be overlooked. And it surprised me going back to it how much I enjoyed it. Well, certainly given that I knew all of its reveals and all of its secrets going in the second time. There's an awful lot of fun just having a look at the setup of it and the strength of the performances in it. I don't think it's vintage David Fincher, but I do think it's a really interesting late 1990s thriller that, I mean, it went through an assortment of guises and could have come out a little bit lighter. It could have come out, well, really quite compromised, really. But the fact that David Fincher made this film at that particular point in his career with a studio that was looking to make an impact with its first big American release, it allowed him to get the film through the system in the shape that he wanted it. Warts and all, The Game is the film, I believe, that he wanted to make. I also think it's the overlooked Fincher movie, and if you've not seen it, I would recommend seeking it out. I'm just going to do a couple of notices. There are 3 ways you can support this podcast, and it helps us. It really helps if you can. Financially, if you really like the podcast and want to support us on Patreon, that's at patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you put a bit of money in there, you get the podcast early, you find out all the gossip on what we're up to, you get the audio of live shows, assuming the audio works, which it has been of late, and again, you just kind of find out what we're up to a little bit. But also with that money, what I'm then able to do is pay new and upcoming writers to write for our website, and I use it to try and hold the ladder for others, really. So hopefully it all goes a little bit circular. It goes to something good. If you also like this podcast and don't mind subscribing to it at your podcast home of choice, that costs you nothing and really helps small independent podcast producers like myself to just try and get noticed and cheat the algorithms a little bit. Likewise, if you don't mind leaving ideally a hugely positive review, that helps me enormously as well and doesn't cost you a bean. If you really, really like Film Stories, we've got loads and loads of magazines. We've got print magazines, Film Stories magazine and Film Junior magazine. You can find all of those at store.filmstories.co.uk, which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not completely bored you, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We've got a website too. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk, and that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, all sorts of bits and bobs there. But I think that's just about it for this time, and thus I'm going to stop trying to sell you things. I'm going to move on. I'm going to go off and watch another load of films. I'm going to write another episode, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all look after yourselves. You all take care. I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.